Good morning, Boker Tov. Toda Rabba for inviting me. Shana Tova in advance. Let's start. Oh. Oh, can we start? Can we start the first movie, please?
We're right now behind the scenes of Revolution music video, and we're about 3 kilometers away from ISIS. And yeah, it's pretty.
I'm here to talk to you about Kurdistan. You just saw Heli Love, who is a global sensation, a Kurdish woman in the Kurdish diaspora from Finland, who is a rap star, who was filming a movie on the front lines while ISIS was threatening and advancing into Iraqi territory. I've just come back from Kurdistan. I'm here to share some observations, and I was there in a capacity as a physician and a humanitarian, but also as a voice against radical Islam, and I think it's an important region for everyone in this room to know about. You've all followed the battle, the war, and now the aftermath of ISIS, and Kurdistan truly is a Zion in waiting and a landlocked Zion, a country that is suffering in post-colonial sequestration. So what you see, you know, of course, are the world-famous Peshmerga fighters. Many of you in this room would have advised them in the capacity of the international coalition that assisted the Kurdish Peshmerga in battling with ISIS. The Peshmerga are a unique fighting force, national heroes in Kurdistan, and by the way, have more women in combat in the Kurdish Peshmerga than even the Israeli military. Though having met with the Kurdish Peshmerga, they have huge admiration for the IDF in particular and deep affection for Israel. When you visit Kurdistan, you see scenes like this. This is an average view of the Kurdish landscape. You see a Yazidi temple in the background, and this is very much the community that was brutally targeted by ISIS for genocide. The Yazidis are amongst the most ancient monotheists in the world, dating back centuries, and their temples take this typical form in the Kurdish landscape. Kurdistan also, this is a view from the epicenter of the Yazidism, Lalish. You can see the flare from a natural gas outlet. That's the flare that you're seeing in bright sunshine and daylight in the spring this year. It is both blessed and cursed with enormous hydrocarbon resources. At least 40 billion barrels of oil, of which 10 billion have been located. At least 100 billion cubic meters of natural gas, makes this an extremely contested region, and is probably the motivation for why Kurdish boundaries, which were designated in 1919, have never been realized into an independent Kurdish state. Now, many of the regions we've been talking about in this meeting have become critically important. I visited Kurdistan 30 kilometers north of Mosul, which was laid siege to by ISIS in a most brutal humanitarian assault. Over 180,000 Christians fled Mosul with their lives intact. Others, for the city of 2 million, had a worse fate. Kurdistan now is hosting 2 million displaced persons, either refugees from Syria or internally displaced persons from inside Iraq, or displaced Kurdistani people that were pushed back from areas repelled by ISIS. Equally, Kurdistan is split and landlocked between these 4 nations: Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. And Turkey, Iran, and Syria are what Professor Boaz Ganor identified as the evil axis. So this is, I'm bringing you life inside the nexus of the evil axis, and the only thing that unites Iran, Turkey, and Syria is their animosity and hatred of the Kurds, and their intention not to allow them to become ever independent. I visited Duhok. This is a view of Duhok. It is a city of 900,000, highly advanced, constructing lots of active construction, and a city of 900,000 is hosting 500,000 refugees itself. That's the burden on this community, and they're doing so with dignity, and the refugees are multi-faith. They are Yazidi, they are Christian, they're Turkmen, they're Assyrian, they're Muslim, and they live together without conflict in some of the most difficult circumstances. The arrival of displaced persons from Syria, the crashing of the oil prices in 2013, 2014, and the assault of ISIS all befell Kurdistan at once, bringing a perfect storm of problems for them. I was brought inside Kurdistan, and I want everyone in this room to write this name down or take a picture of this slide. This is Jan Kazilhan, who brought me into Kurdistan, a Kurdish Yazidi German national, who himself was a victim of persecution in Turkey. His parents therefore left Turkey, went to Germany, where they received immigration, and his parents were not highly educated. A little boy aged 5 is going to German schools, not doing well without the language, so his family asked the neighbor, can you look after our son when he is 5 years old, and so he can learn some German. So the neighbor was Mr. and Mrs. Schultz. They were Holocaust survivors. They educated him in Germany. They helped him with his homework, and at the age of 10, Professor Kazilhan went to the public library to learn about the meaning of the word genocide. He is now the world's leading authority on the psychological trauma of migration, and he personally intervened when he began to hear reports of the genocide of the Yazidi people. These are the people that were driven onto the mountain in Mount Sinjar by ISIS, where they died in the August heat, dehydrated, where babies died of heat stroke and heat exhaustion and starvation. He saw these images and within days had written an opinion piece in a German newspaper. He motivated the German government to secure 95 million euros of funding for the safeguarding of whatever Yazidi people could be safeguarded. And he brought to Germany 1,100 Yazidi women and girls who'd been sexually enslaved or tortured by ISIS. 3 years later, or 4 years later, in Baden-Württemberg, I think is the province, all of those girls and women are alive, whereas many left behind have committed suicide. He knew this was not sufficient to just bring them, so he is now building an army of psychologists, which is where I went to teach, inside Iraq. These psychologists are managing the child soldiers that have come back from ISIS, the girls that have come back from sexual enslavement, the women that have come back from sexual enslavement, and trying to rebuild devastated lives. And many of these psychologists, with whom I was hugely impressed, they're 28 years old, they're kind of the age that people here at the IDC are studying, are themselves victims of genocide at the hands of Saddam, genocide survivors of the Anfal, genocide survivors of the Halabja. So we have this remarkably moving interaction of genocide survivors trying to lift each other in one of the world's most disadvantaged nations, in a nation that is the largest stateless nation of people. They have a population of 36 million, slightly less than Canada, slightly more than Australia, that does not get to have their own country. I was sitting in an audience like this, listening to this lady you see on the screen, and as a physician, I'm a seasoned physician, I saw that her face was mask-like, and she described in harrowing detail her enslavement to 8 different individual men at the hands of ISIS. She was a mother of 2. A man sitting next to me, rather like all of you, elegantly dressed in a blue blazer, began having tears down his face while she was speaking, and I turned to him to ask if he was okay. He turned out to be her brother. He paid a $7,000 ransom for her release. And when the time came, she discovered her sister-in-law was in captivity. She had to make the terrible choice of, do I seek my freedom and leave my sister-in-law? Instead, the ISIS commander said, well, we'll need another $7,000 for your sister-in-law. So her sister-in-law was freed, and this woman was further incarcerated. She was so-called married to men from Iraq, from Libya, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. One of the so-called ISIS husbands was a plastic surgeon. So this is not an ideology that is unique only to thugs. Now her mission, she sat in front of 200 of us, was to let us know what this ideology did so that the genocide on the Yazidi people may not be forgotten. One of the teachings of Yazidism, there are only 800,000 Yazidis left in the world, is that they must have endogamous marriage. They cannot perpetuate the faith if they marry a non-Yazidi. And so now the leaders of the Yazidi community are facing the very real possibility of extinction through genocide because of ISIS. By the way, the 74th genocide in the history of the Yazidi people. And the Kurdish people themselves have had over 700 years of persecution. I visited camps where I found orphan children that were well-dressed, clean, with haircuts, living in very humble conditions, hopeful for a future, going to school in multiple sessions, There are too many children to put in one school every day. They have to have 3 or 4 sessions. And people here in Israel told me in the beginning in Israel this was also the case. And huge fan base for Ronaldo and Messi. You see here Dr. Kazilhan meeting and mixing with the boys whose lives he is rebuilding. In this moment, I will just tell you that as a physician, I encountered reports of the sleep disturbances of children after returning from ISIS. Some of them have been held, not necessarily the children in this picture, for at least 3 years as child soldiers. They come back speaking Arabic, forgetting their own language. They go to their mother, cover your arms, cover your hair. This is not Islamic. They pray compulsively the way that they've been indoctrinated to do. None of this is Islamic belief. As a Muslim, I can tell you this is not Islamic belief, the compulsion. Some of the children are unable to sleep if they do not have a weapon-shaped object next to them. Some of the children are enacting decapitation in their sleep in the form of a parasomnia. Some of the women are running out of the camp in the middle of the night, terror-struck, thinking that ISIS is coming, and have even sustained ankle fractures doing this. So there's a great need for us as sleep specialists to research in this area. So this population is suffering deeply and must not be forgotten. Most people will not know much about Kurdistan, though Israel has a population of between 200,000 to 300,000 Kurdish people in her borders. Over 30% of political positions in the Kurdish regional government are held by women. I was there the day before the national election in Iraq, which was the first election after the Battle of ISIS. And everywhere you go, you see a picture of a Kurdish woman, the vast majority are Sunni Muslim, unveiled, on a billboard, asking for your votes. We go around the world as Americans looking for societies to liberate, to advance, to elevate. I'm thinking of my own Pakistan, which in one way is extremely advanced, in another way is extremely behind. Afghanistan, and yet right under our noses is this extraordinarily rich, multi-faith country with advanced concepts of egalitarianism between men and women that has been utterly neglected. Some of the students at the University of Duhok, they were not my students, they were English literature students. Here you see one, studying Anna Karenina in English translation alongside George Orwell and Henry James. Show me another location in the Middle East where this kind of scholarship is going on freely and openly other than the state of Israel. You would be hard-pressed, and I've been to most of the region. Kurdistan spends more percentage of its GDP on education than many advanced countries, including the United States or Japan. 24,000 students study here, entirely paid for by the state. Of course, much of this is now pressured because of the fall in oil revenues and the siege between Baghdad and Kurdistan economically, which is how Baghdad puts pressure on Kurdistan. After the meeting, I was very, very much wanting to meet the Peshmerga, and I didn't think I'd be granted permission. But a few hours later, I met at the base in the city of Duhok, the Peshmerga soldiers. These are women. I am not very tall. I'm 5'4". These women are not as tall as me. They have just returned from battle against ISIS. I asked them, what message do you have for me when I speak to other audiences? We need our independence. We deserve our independence. I met with their leaders. Many of these women themselves are commanders. One of the commanders spoke to me and talked to me about how when ISIS came into her country, she told her husband, honey, you watch the 3 kids. I'm off to the front line. I asked her, how could you leave your children knowing ISIS was less than 30 kilometers from Duhok in Mosul? She said, unless I safeguard my nation, I cannot safeguard my children. That was her simple answer. And then she burst into a smile and said, by the way, I personally killed 2 ISIS commanders. And with great pride, understand this force is mostly Sunni Muslim. These are the Muslims that are at the front line of the terrorism that all of us are here sitting trying to battle. Though this force is also containing Christian Peshmerga, Jewish Peshmerga, Yazidi Peshmerga. The colonels that I met with have a personal security detail that is multi-faith. That is the level of depth and trust in this force. So when we think about how the Kurds must feel, I ask my friends that are Kurdish. Here you see a Kurdish colonel looking out at the landscape in the countryside in Sumail, outside of Duhok, and they feel desolate. There was a referendum, and I'm closing with this in a few seconds. There was a referendum on September 25th. The President Barzani wanted the people to have a chance to say, do we want independence? 93% of Kurdish people voted. Incredible turnout. It's unified. And what was the response? global silence. The only international leader of any stature to say the Kurds have political rights and a mature political system that warrants an independent state is the Prime Minister here, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which was a deeply felt truth that the Kurdish people heard. Canada was silent, United States was silent, Britain was silent, Europe was silent. All the nations that used the Kurdish Peshmerga to fight the battles on the ground, though the Kurds do admit they've got great support from the United States, were silent. And this to me is morally unacceptable. We are now looking at a region which is increasingly hostile, Iran, Turkey, which cannot decide if it wants to use the Kurds to kill ISIS or then murder the Kurds themselves. Syria, as you know, is developing dangerous vacuums. What wouldn't we give for a powerful alliance of a 90% Sunni Muslim country that feels strongly identified with Israel, strongly identified with Jeffersonian democracy, and yet we neglect it? One of the generals said to me, we know the Jews very well. We know Israel very well. The Jewish memory is our memory. They were a nation and a people without a state for centuries. We are a nation and we are a people without a state. So the resonance is deep. I'm going to leave you with scenes of hopefulness that I hope all of us here in any capacity, whatever abilities you have, you can serve to, so that we live to see this moment again mature for real. This is Kurdistan the night before the referendum.